Hey, it's good to see everybody. Sorry to have taken so long to uh, put out a video, but maybe for those of you that don't know, is that we did have coronavirus. I did have it, um, and I have asthma, and so my lungs have always been um, a weakness, I guess you could say, for me. And whenever I get one thing, I usually come up with pneumonia. And after my COVID, like right after my COVID had finished up, I started feeling like I was getting pneumonia, and I ended up in the hospital with it. And it was bacterial pneumonia. It was not COVID-related pneumonia, and um, it's taken me a while to get to where I can speak and take full breaths again. Matter of fact, today is the first day that I've been able to take a full deep breath in my lungs and not actually cough every time. And so I'm tremendously grateful to God for his healing touch, and I'm grateful to you for your prayers. Please keep them coming. My plan is to be there this coming Sunday to preach. I'm not sure how long the sermon's going to be. I'm not sure how long this Bible study is going to be. Um, but that being said, I just want to say how much I miss all of you, and I look forward to seeing you again. I know my family looks forward to seeing everybody. We've been this coronavirus is just no joke. It's really not. I recommend everyone be as absolutely careful as possible. Take all the precautions you can. Most people it doesn't affect that much. The kids in our house, they got the sniffles, maybe a little cough every now and then. They were tired and cranky a little bit, but that was about it. And then there's all the way at the other end of the spectrum, there was me. So don't play around with this thing. And, don't let somebody tell you that you're being that you have no faith when you're wearing a mask. That's not fair. Who is to say that God did not give the idea for that mask to the person who invented it? So let's err on the side of grace. Let's err on the side of loving each other as much as possible, and being very respectful of each other's not just physical health in this time, but our mental health, I believe, is also being affected by it as well. So that being said, I love you, and I thank you for the love that you've shown me. Before we get into our Bible study, why don't we have a moment of prayer? God, I just thank you so much for your love, for your kindness, your generosity. I thank you for your grace, your healing. And I ask, God, that you would continue all those things for us, and that now as we dig a little into your word, that you would also give us grace to learn, to be deeply held by your word, and to be guided by it in our daily lives. I ask, God, that you would give us great love for you, for your kingdom, and for each other. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Tonight we're going to continue in 1 Peter. Going to go into chapter 3, and we're going to do verses 1 through 7 tonight. Now, before we do the reading, I'd just like to make sure we know where we're at in this. The very first word in the English Standard Version tonight is likewise, which tells us something about what's happening. Where we're at is this list of things that Peter is saying that we should do or be. So, for example, in chapter 2, verse 1, where this particular list starts out. He says, "So put away all malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander." Okay, so that's, and then he elaborates on that. And then in chapter 2, verse 11, he continues with abstain from the passions of the flesh. In chapter 2, verse 13, he says, be subject to the governing authorities as good citizens. In chapter 2, verse 18, he says specifically to servants, because then he moves into specific categories of folks. He says, servants, be subject to your masters, be good servants. And then we get to where we are in chapter 3, and this is an interesting set of verses because he's directing it towards wives and husbands. So I invite you to listen as we read, and you're welcome to follow on with the Bible that you have with you. Peter writes this in chapter 3, verse 1. He says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. All right, let's pause there for a moment. So this particular little command or dialogue is to wives, women who are married. So if we just read this very quickly, and we read it through the sensibilities of the day that we live in today, and we start to dissect this with today's brain, meaning that we apply rules about feminism and things like that to it, we are going to come away from this very, very angry. Why? Because today's sensibilities and the things we're going through today are in conflict with what Peter is saying. They are. You have to look at what Peter's asking. If you took away from this the idea that he's writing to wives, to female spouses, and you just applied this in its regular sense, you'll see that he's not asking them to do anything that Jesus hasn't already asked us to do for each other. He's actually continuing the theme that Jesus has already established in his ministry, because it's the theme of submitting to each other, which is, in fact, oppositional to the way the world teaches us. The world teaches us today that we want to be strong, we want to be completely self-sufficient, that we want to be, without the need for help and things like that. But our world is also producing some pretty horrible byproducts of that thinking. And so now, and we even see our society shifting in its thinking now, because the generation starting with the millennials is actually thinking in a different way than the previous generations before. They're actually thinking in ways that are more in line with some of what the scriptures teach. So for those of us that aren't in the millennial generation, I would recommend that you spend some time and listen to the hearts of those in the millennial and the younger generation that's following them, just simply because their way of thinking is radically different, and they're learning things in different patterns than we learned. And it's kind of interesting that if you spend some time and be objective about it, you'll realize that, they actually sound like people with Christian ideas, and that's because they're learning through different lenses than we learned. They're hearing things with different ears than we heard. Their cultural expectations have been shifted, and so it's this really different thing, and it gives me actually some hope. And so let's keep that in mind and examine this passage. He's saying, and let's look at what Peter is trying to establish. What is Peter trying to accomplish with this, with these 6 verses, when he says, "Wives, be subject to your husband"? Why does he say that? Well, he tells you right off the bat. He says, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without word by the conduct of their wives. What he's saying is, ladies, and it looked like he was specifically talking about women whose husbands were not believers, or maybe weren't very deep spiritual thinkers, however we approach that. But it does look like that in this case, these were women who were followers of Jesus Christ whose husbands may not have been. And so what he's saying here is, use this example of women from the past in the faith that was Judaism and is now becoming this Christian faith. Submit to your husband with the ideal that you are partners in this thing, and you both have specific roles in your relationship, and so that in being like God has said that you should be, that your husband would follow and see this pattern, and become curious about what it is that makes you like this and has made you into this new thing. He's not saying be somebody's doormat. What he's saying is, be the woman that God has called you to be in this moment. Be in the role, lay down some of your expectations for this moment, and see what God does when you pick up all of what God's expectations for this moment. It's difficult. I'm not going to say that it's easy. I'm not, because but he's not talking about doing it just for the sake of keeping women suppressed. He's doing it very specifically right off the bat, so that their husbands can be won to God's kingdom, so that they can be saved. And let me ask you, ladies, what would you be willing to surrender for your husband to be saved? That seems to be the question that's in the air. I'm not saying you need to surrender yourself to abuse. I'm not saying you need to be turned into a doormat. That's not what I'm saying. But maybe I should say it this way. There's been times in mine and Rebecca's relationship when we've had disagreements, right? Happens. We've been married 21 years. And, we still have disagreements on occasion. And there have been times when we could not come to an agreement on something. And my dear wife just said to me, "You know what? We can't seem to come to an agreement on this. We're just going to go with what you say, so that at least we can be in obedience to God's pattern for the relationship. And it turns out that I found out later I was wrong. Has that ever happened? Guys, you just were terribly wrong, but you didn't know it at the moment. But you know what was weird in those moments? God actually blessed my wrongness in two ways. One, he didn't let my life become a catastrophe for being wrong. That was one thing. But the other thing that was a tremendous blessing was God allowed me to see that I was wrong and become very much more appreciative of my wife. So God blessed my wife's submission. I don't treat her like a doormat. I don't treat her like she's my servant or my slave. She is an equal partner in my life. But there are times when we can't come to an agreement, and so she has decided that what she will do is to follow God's pattern and calling in our marriage in those moments, and God has blessed it even when I've been wrong. So, if I had to say anything, please learn from my mistakes. That God is gracious and full of mercy, even in those moments when I'm so pig-headed I can't even see the end of my own nose. But let's continue. This isn't all about me. So the focus here is salvation. That is what Peter is saying. The focus of everything about who we are. We should be willing to lay down pieces of our lives, all of our lives, in fact, who we think we are, so that people may be saved. That's the point of this passage. It's not to subjugate women. It's to bring men to Christ. And on the other side of this, he gets down to verse 7, and he says something interesting there. He says this, likewise, husbands. Oh, now the husbands get a little chat. All right? Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So I'll point out a few things here, and this will be the last verse we talk about tonight. First of all, when we say that, there may be some of you who just saw that passage that says that show women as the weaker vessel, and your hair caught on fire. Sorry, that verse is there. I'm not taking it out of Scripture. I don't feel like I have the authority to do that. So what do we do with it? Well, we ask ourselves, what reality are we dealing with? Are we dealing with the reality that is a bunch of wishes? Like, I wish this were the way things were. I wish this was what things were. Or are we dealing with the reality that God has constructed? God has constructed things a certain way, and in this reality, because of the fallenness of humanity, there are roles occupied in the marriage by the husband and roles occupied by the wife, right? Don't let your pride and your personality get you wound up so that you can't see your place in this. And actually, the instruction here, Paul is kind of addressing men to say, don't look down at your wife. Yeah, there are some things she can't do. She's not going to be the one that's going to, go out and plow all the fields. She's not going to be the one that does this or that. But I would just balance that with, guys, how many of you want to be the one that has the babies? Not this guy. So just keep in mind, don't let your pride cause those verses to be unheard. Okay? He is saying something important here, and he's actually reminding us of something that actually were given way back in chapter 2 of Genesis, when Moses writes that Male and female, he created them in his image. He created them both in his image. And they're to be partners in this marriage thing together. The man was created first, and the woman was created because the man couldn't be alone. So it's not that maybe we shouldn't try to establish some priorities around the words of weaker. It's that, I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know how I could live my life without my wife. She's that critical to who I am in every part of what I do. Her identity and my identity are wound together. I don't understand myself without her anymore. And so I would just say that that we are equal recipients of God's grace. And that's what Peter is trying to say here. This isn't about a control narrative. This is about God's grace. And the very last phrase of that is something that should, guys, really sit on your mind, and you should really wrestle with this. He says, they are heirs with you of the grace of life. And he says this whole thing, if we take it apart, he says, show honor to the woman. And then at the very end says, so that your prayers may not be hindered. That they may not be hindered. Honor your wives. How many of us pray and pray and pray, and we don't feel like they make it past the ceiling? And I'm speaking to married men here. How are you treating your wife? Are you honoring her as the wonderful partner of your life that God has made her to be? So I just want you to wrestle with that, because I want my desire for us as a church is that all of us would have an effective and established prayer life with God. And if we as married men are doing something in our relationship that dishonors our wives, then necessarily what I'm seeing here is that it's going to hinder our prayer lives. Because if you think about it, if God has paired us with this beautiful person and made us one entity together, their prayers and our prayers should be lifted. We can't look at that other individual as being someone less than us and still expect our communication with God to be as effective as it could be. Peter is telling us we need to understand that relationship we have with our spouse is going to have an impact on our relationship with God. So husbands, treat your wives with honor duly, and your prayer life with God will be blessed. I think that's a good place for us to break for tonight. My prayer for you is that God blesses you and that He establishes firmly His covenant within your life through His Son, Jesus Christ. Thank you, and have a good evening.